How did a medieval English peasant, having neither modern tools nor building materials nor engineering knowledge, build a dwelling capable of resisting icy winds and penetrating frosts? We imagine their homes as flimsy, windswept shacks where winter's survival was a miracle. But what if this squat, hovelled house was not a primitive hovel, but a pinnacle of organic architecture, a brilliant engineering solution honed over centuries for a single purpose: to preserve precious heat? This story takes you to a world where building was not a craft, but an art of survival, a complex system of knowledge about landscape, materials, and the laws of nature. This is the story of how our ancestors, using only what the forest and the earth gave them, created not just walls and roofs, but real living organisms that breathed, warmed, and protected. How did they choose a place for a house by reading the wind and sun? Why was curved wood better than straight wood? And how could a house built without a single nail be the most effective heat trap? Today, we will reveal 10 ingenious principles that were at the heart of medieval peasant house construction. These are 10 secrets that allowed people not just to survive the winter, but to create a stable and warm shelter in the midst of a hostile world. Are you ready to learn that the humble hut was a marvel of engineering? Then let's get started. The first and most important stage of construction began long before the first trunk was cut or the first hole was dug. It began with a silent but intense dialogue with the earth, the wind, and the sun. The choice of a place for a house was not a matter of a beautiful view or convenience, but a fundamental survival strategy, the first and main line of defense against the winter cold. The medieval peasant, whose life depended on these decisions, read the landscape with the same meticulousness with which we read a complex engineering manual today. It was an art based on generations of observation. The ideal location was the south or southeast slope of a low, gentle hill. This location offered two huge, invaluable advantages. First, it was free passive solar energy. The house, with its long side facing south, during the short winter day, when the sun hung low over the horizon, caught every precious ray on its wall and dark roof, greedily soaking up its warmth. Secondly, the very mass of the hill behind the back of the house served as a powerful natural shield. It took the brunt of the prevailing cold and wet north and northwest winds, which brought with them the most brutal frosts and snowstorms. The peasant instinctively, with an almost animal instinct, avoided the picturesque lowlands and river valley bottoms. These places, seemingly cozy and protected in summer, turned into death traps of cold in winter. Cold air, being denser and heavier than warm air, at night, like an invisible icy river, flowed down from the surrounding hills and accumulated in these lowlands. So-called frost pockets were formed here, where the temperature could be 5 or even 10 degrees lower than on the slope, just a few tens of meters higher. Frost lay longer here, and the fogs were thicker and colder. Proximity to the forest was also critical, but here too moderation was observed. The forest was a source of building materials and fuel, as well as another giant wind barrier. A strip of trees a few hundred meters north of the house could significantly weaken the force of the icy winds. But building the house close to the forest was dangerous. It attracted predators and created constant shade, dampness, and fire danger. Finally, hydrology was taken into account. The house was built close enough to a stream or well, but on a natural elevation or slope to ensure good drainage. A shallow gutter was often built around the house to drain rainwater running off the roof to keep the base of the walls dry. This thoughtful, holistic approach solved half of the heating and safety problems in advance, making nature itself the chief architect and ally. The heart and skeleton of most medieval English peasant houses was a unique and ingeniously simple structure known as the cruck frame. It was a technology perfectly adapted to limited resources and simple tools, allowing for an incredibly strong and durable structure without a single expensive metal nail. Crack was a pair of large solid tree trunks, usually oak for its strength and resistance to decay, that had a natural bend. Finding two nearly identical curved trees was a great stroke of luck and required the carpenter to have intimate knowledge of his forest. The selected trunk was hand-sawed lengthwise into two mirrored halves with a long saw, or, more labor-intensive, split with wooden wedges. These two massive curved beams, like giant ribs, were placed on a solid stone base, and joined at the top to form a giant A. This A-frame was the main load-bearing structure of the entire house, taking the entire weight of the roof. There could be 2, 3, or 4 such frames, depending on the length of the house. They were connected by a long ridge beam that ran across the top and several rows of side purlins. The genius of this system was its remarkable efficiency and economy of material. The peasant did not have to search for perfectly straight and long logs, which were rare and went to the needs of the Lord for building castles or ships. He searched the forest for trees that had already grown with the right curve. The curved shape of the crack naturally created both the sloping line of the walls and the basis for the steep gable roof in a single, solid element. This gave the house incredible strength and resistance to hurricane winds and the weight of wet snow. All joints in such a frame were made with the help of complex carpenter's notches, studs and grooves, which were carved with an axe and chisel and fixed with thick oak dowels. The timber for the frame was often green, i.e., freshly cut. It was softer and easier to work. As it dried in the finished structure, the wood dried a little and all the joints were tightened even tighter, creating a monolithic but slightly elastic structure. Assembled on the ground, this heavy frame was then lifted by the entire community with the help of levers, ropes, and loud shouts. The frame on the cracks was not just a set of logs, but a powerful skeleton, ready to take on the thick protective skin of the walls and roof. Once the mighty oak skeleton of the house was erected, it was time to build up the flesh, the walls. And here, medieval builders used another ancient and ingenious technology known as wattle-and-daub. These walls were not just a barrier from the outside world, but an active, breathing element of the home's climate control, capable of storing heat, regulating humidity, and creating a healthy microclimate. First, between the vertical posts and horizontal purlins of the frame, a lattice-based wattle was created. For this purpose, thick stakes made of oak or ash were driven into the ground and into the beams at a distance of about half a meter from each other. These stakes were then tightly and carefully interwoven with thinner and more flexible twigs, most often from hazel, or willow. These twigs were used freshly cut as long as they remained flexible. The process was similar to weaving a giant basket. The result was a strong and resilient, yet lightweight base ready to be sheathed. Then the whole community, men, women, and even children, would begin to knead the daub. This was a real alchemy, the recipe for which varied from region to region. The base was local clay, which served as a binder and had a high heat capacity. Large amounts of chopped straw, hay, and sometimes even moss or wool shavings were added to it, which worked as reinforcing fibers to prevent the wall from cracking as it dried. The most important component was fresh cow dung. It not only contained undigested fibers, which worked as additional reinforcement, but also, thanks to enzymes, served as a natural plasticizer and glue, making the mixture more viscous and sticky. This thick, viscous mixture was manually poured over the wicker base on both sides, carefully pressing it into the lattice so that no voids remained. The thickness of the walls could reach 20-30 centimeters. The surface was then leveled with a wooden board or just palms and left to dry. After drying, the walls were often covered with lime whitewash. Lime not only gave the house a neat white look, but also served as an antiseptic and created an additional water-repellent layer. The annual spring ritual was to put fresh clay over the cracks that appeared over the winter, keeping the thermal circuit of the house in perfect condition. If the walls were the skin of the house, the roof was its thick woolen coat, its main and most important shield against cold, rain, and snow. Modern calculations show that it is through the roof that up to 30 to 40% of all heat loss in a poorly insulated building occurs. And medieval peasants, not knowing the exact figures, understood this intuitively. So they created an incredibly effective insulation from the most affordable and renewable material available, thatch or straw. A thatched roof was not just a covering, but a massive, multi-layered insulation system. Its thickness was staggering and could reach a meter or more, especially on older houses where new layers were laid on top of worn-out old ones. The construction of such a roof was an art, and a good thatcher was worth his weight in gold. A layer of twigs or branches was first laid on rafters made of thin poles. Then straw, wheat or rye, or even better, long-stem water reeds were laid, starting at the bottom from the roof overhang and moving up to the ridge. Each bundle was tied tightly to the batten with soaked ropes of vegetable fibers or thin willow rods. The layers were laid overlapping, like the scales of a giant fish, at a very steep angle, so that water would roll down as fast as possible before it had time to penetrate. The main secret of insulation lay in its structure. Millions of hollow straw or reed stalks and tightly packed layers created a huge number of tiny air pockets. It was this still, trapped air that was the perfect insulator. It prevented the precious heat from the hearth, which always rose upwards, from escaping outside. This thick coat also effectively protected from the summer heat, keeping the inside cool. This system had another ingenious side effect. The smoke from the central hearth without a chimney slowly seeped through the lower layers of the thatched roof. This smoke, rich in creosote and other terry substances, acted as a powerful preservative. It impregnated the thatch, making it unattractive to insect pests, mice, and birds, as well as preventing the growth of mold, mildew, and rot. Thus, the smoke that was an integral part of the heating system simultaneously worked to preserve the roof itself, extending its life for many years. A heavy, thick, tarred, and smoked roof was the perfect armor that kept the heat inside and the cold and moisture outside. In the constant battle against the cold, the medieval builder used not only what grew on the ground, but also the earth itself as a building material and natural insulator. One of the oldest and most effective techniques, especially in the early Middle Ages, was the partial burial of the house in the ground. This type of structure, known to archaeologists as a Grubenhaus or recessed floor house, was an ingenious way to harness the planet's free and constant heat energy for protection from the cold. Instead of erecting the house directly on the surface, the builders dug a rectangular pit 50 centimeters to a meter deep. The floor of the future dwelling was thus much lower than the freezing level of the soil. Already at this stage, a colossal gain in heat saving was achieved. The Earth has tremendous thermal inertia. Below a certain depth, its temperature remains almost stable all year round. At +8, even at shallower depths, the ground cools much slower than air and rarely freezes through in a mild English winter. By sinking his house into the ground, the farmer effectively insulated the lower, most vulnerable part of the walls from direct contact with the icy air and penetrating wind. Instead of coming into contact with the atmosphere, where the temperature might have been 5 degrees Celsius or 10, the walls were in contact with the ground, where the temperature was around 0 degrees or even higher. This radically reduced heat loss through the floor and the base of the walls. The wind could not physically blow heat out from under the house. The excavated earth was often not taken away, but used to create a low berm around the above-ground part of the walls, which further strengthened the insulation. Besides, such a construction was simply more economical. It required less material to build the walls, as a significant part of them was formed by the earth itself. The walls of the excavation were sometimes reinforced with wooden boards or wattles to prevent crumbling. The house became squat, low, with a smaller area of exterior walls, which also reduced heat loss. Living in such a semi-subterranean space created a special sense of security and comfort, a feeling of being in a protected hole in the womb of Mother Earth. It was not a sign of poverty, but a highly rational and energy-efficient solution that allowed one to survive the harshest winters with minimal consumption of precious fuel. The medieval peasant, whose survival depended entirely on crops and weather, lived in perfect harmony with the cycles of nature, and his house was not just a static box, but a kind of precise instrument tuned to the daily and annual movement of the sun across the sky. The orientation of the dwelling to the sides of the world was not accidental, but a carefully considered, fundamental strategy for passive solar heating, the secrets of which are now being rediscovered by green architects. As a rule, the longhouse had its long axis in the east-west direction. This seemingly simple solution was of great importance for the thermal balance of the building. In this orientation, one of the long walls of the house faced strictly south and the other north. The south wall became the main passive solar collector. Throughout the short winter day, when the sun moves on a low trajectory in the south, its rays fell on this wall at a nearly right angle, maximizing the transfer of thermal energy. The dark, earthy-colored earthen wall, having low reflectivity, albedo, and high thermal inertia, greedily absorbed this heat, accumulated it in its mass, and then slowly, during the long evening and night hours, radiated it inside the house. It was on this southern, warm wall that the few and tiny windows, if any, were made. These small openings let in not only scanty light, but also direct sunlight, which brightly stained the earthen floor, warming it and the interior decoration. In summer, when the sun was high, the wide overhang of the thatched roof cast a shadow on the south wall, protecting it from overheating. The northern wall, on the contrary, was cold and deaf. In winter, it received almost no direct sunlight and was most vulnerable to the icy northern winds. That is why they tried to make it as solid as possible, without any openings that would become cold bridges. Often, a stable, a peat shed, or a woodpile was attached to the house from the northern side, which served as an additional unheated buffer, protecting the living area from the cold. The entrance to the house was most often located on the east or west end wall, sometimes on the south wall, but almost never on the north wall. Such an elaborate layout turned the house into an effective heat trap. It was open to the life-giving heat from the south and sealed tightly against the deadly cold from the north. One of the most iconic and ingenious architectural designs of medieval Northern Europe was the longhouse. It was not just a building tradition, but an elaborate, multifunctional survival system that elegantly solved one of the main problems of winter: heating. The design of the house was originally intended to have a built-in, living, self-regulating, and totally free heating system in the form of livestock. Architecturally, a longhouse was an elongated rectangular structure under one common continuous roof. The interior space was most often divided into two parts, not by a capital wall, but only by a light wicker partition, a wooden barrier, or simply an open passage called a cross passage. One, usually the more prestigious and cleaner part, was where people lived. This part was called the hall. The other, often located a little lower down the natural slope of the terrain, contained the peasant's most valuable asset: his livestock, a cow, a couple of oxen, a few sheep. This part was called byre, stable. This close proximity, which today seems to us the height of unsanitation, was the key to survival. Large farm animals generate enormous amounts of metabolic heat as they digest their food. By integrating the stable directly into the structure of the dwelling, the farmer prevented this heat from being wasted. The heat from the animals heated their part of the house and then passed through a light, airtight partition and through the air to the living half unimpeded. The wall between man and livestock became a permanent, 24-hour low-temperature radiator. In addition, the floor in the living area, hall, was often 15-20 centimeters higher than in the stable. Byre. This was dictated not only by elementary hygiene, to prevent sewage from the stable from reaching people, but also by the laws of physics. Warm air from the animals, being lighter than cold air, naturally rose upwards and freely penetrated into the human half. The result was a constant, albeit weak, natural flow of heat in the house from the lower, animal end to the upper, human end. This was an ingenious symbiosis inherent in the architecture itself. People gave animals protection from bad weather and predators, and in return, animals shared with people not only food and draft power, but also their invaluable warmth of life, helping them to survive the fiercest frosts. The constant sounds and smells of living creatures behind the wall were not an irritant, but a soothing reminder of life and well-being. The main enemy of warmth in any home is the uncontrolled infiltration of cold air, or simply a draft. Any hole in the wall is a gap in the defense, through which precious, hard-earned heat escapes and the icy wind enters. The medieval builder understood this more than anyone else, so the entire construction strategy was aimed at creating the most airtight, almost sealed fortress with as few holes as possible. There were practically no windows in the modern sense in a peasant's house. Glass was an incredible over-the-top luxury, available only for stained glass in cathedrals and windows in the castles of the richest lords. The peasant could not afford it. Therefore, windows were either not made at all, preferring to live in cozy semi-darkness by the light of the hearth, or they were tiny, no bigger than a head, openings in the wall. Their main function was not insulation, but minimal ventilation and the possibility to look out to assess the weather or to see who was approaching the house. At night and for the whole winter period, these holes were plugged with a bundle of straw, old rags, or closed with primitive wooden shutters inside and outside. Every extra opening was an unacceptable luxury, a hole in the thermal circuit of the house. The door was the second weak point. To minimize heat loss, the doorway was as low and narrow as possible. A tall person had to bend down to get in, but this drastically reduced the amount of cold air that rushed in every time the door was open. The door itself was massive, made of thick, rough boards, and often had no metal hinges, but rotated on simple wooden spikes embedded in the threshold and vestibule. It was locked from the inside with a heavy wooden deadbolt. For additional sealing from inside, a heavy cowhide or several layers of dense felt were hung on the doorway for the winter, creating a kind of vestibule or air curtain which damped the draft. The only technologically necessary opening, apart from the door, was a hole in the roof for the smoke to escape. But it was also made as small as possible, just enough to ensure a minimum draft and prevent the family from suffocating with carbon monoxide. It was located not directly above the hearth, but a little to the side, so that rainwater would not drip directly into the fire. Often a simple wooden flap on a pole was provided to partially cover the opening during strong winds or blizzards. This strategy of total tightness turned the house into a dark but warm shelter, a veritable cocoon, safely protected from the hostile outside world. The central hearth was not just a place to build a fire. It was designed and built as the physical and spiritual heart of the house, its main heat reactor and center of social life. Its design and layout were the result of centuries of experience aimed at maximizing heat output, versatility, and safety in a home without a chimney. Unlike the later wall-mounted fireplace, which inefficiently warms one wall, the hearth was always placed in the center of a single room. This was a key architectural decision. This arrangement allowed the radiant heat from the fire to spread evenly in all directions, 360 degrees, warming the floor, the walls, and all the people wherever they were. This created a single heat field, with cooking in the center and sleeping and working around the edges. The construction of a hearth began with careful preparation of the foundation. A shallow hole was dug in the earthen floor, which was filled with rubble or broken stone for drainage, so that moisture from the ground would not rise to the fire. A thick layer of greasy clay was carefully tamped on top of the drainage. The clay, gradually drying out and being burnt by the daily fire, became as hard as a ceramic pod and created a reliable fireproof cushion that prevented the straw bedding on the floor from catching fire. On the perimeter of this clay circle was often laid a low border of flat, specially selected river stones or flagstones. These stones not only kept the coals and ashes inside the hearth boundaries, but also worked as an important element of the heat accumulator. Heated by the fire during the day, they continued to slowly and gently release the accumulated heat long after the flames died down, creating a comfortable microclimate around them. The main hearth stone, the largest and flattest, was often considered sacred, the guardian spirit of the house. Having such a specially prepared, slightly elevated and fireproof location was critical. It concentrated the fire at one point, making it more manageable and safer. All life in the house was organized around this heat center. The center hearth design was the epitome of simplicity and ingenious efficiency, an ideal solution for a one-room dwelling where each element had to perform several functions at once. No peasant house in the Middle Ages was built alone. Perhaps the most important, though completely invisible building technology was not wood or clay, but the strength of the peasant community. Erecting a new house for a young family, for the burned out or newcomers, was a collective endeavor in which the whole village participated, directly or indirectly. It was not just neighborly help, but part of an unwritten but unbreakable social contract, a system of mutual obligations known as boon work, the basis of survival in a world where one could only die alone. The building process was divided into stages, and each stage required collective strength. The harvesting of wood, especially the massive curved cracks for the frame, required the coordinated efforts of several experienced men. They would go to the forest together, fell the selected wood together with axes and wedges, and trim it together. Transportation of these heavy, multi-hundred logs from forest to village was only possible collectively, using the pulling power of oxen owned by several families and simple but effective levers and rollers. The culmination of the construction and a real celebration for the whole village was the day the frame was lifted. The A-frames assembled on the ground were incredibly heavy. Only a large group of men, acting as a single organism under the loud rhythmic commands of the headman or the most experienced carpenter, could lift them upright and put them in place. They used long poles with slings, strong hemp ropes, and their own muscle power. It was dangerous work, requiring complete trust in each other. At the same time, women and children were doing equally important work. They turned into a living conveyor belt of building materials. Women were responsible for preparing daub, wall clay. They brought dozens of buckets of water from the well, kneaded with bare feet huge piles of clay with straw and dung to the right consistency. It was hard physical labor. The process of applying clay to the wattle-and-daub was also a team effort that allowed the walls to be erected quickly in a few days while the weather was dry. The children did not sit idle either. They collected moss for caulking cracks, carried stones for the foundation, and trampled clay. In this way, through play and as much help as they could, they absorbed the building skills of their ancestors from a young age. The same was true for the roof. Covering the roof with a thick layer of thatch was hard and laborious work, requiring a whole brigade. Some below prepared and fed the sheaves, others, standing on rickety scaffolding, received them, and the most experienced master roofer laid and fixed the thatch, forming a dense waterproof shell. But construction did not end with the erection of the house. The annual collective repair was an equally obligatory ritual. Every fall, before the onset of cold weather, the community helped each other to inspect and treat the houses. Men climbed on the roofs, checking and patching thatch gaps. Women prepared fresh clay and sealed cracks in the walls that had appeared over the summer. This mutual aid was the most reliable insurance. The peasant knew that if his house was damaged by a storm or fire, he would not be left with his family in the open air. The community was his main construction team, mutual aid fund, and repair service. And this social technology, based on trust and mutual responsibility, was stronger than any oak plank and more reliable than any stone wall. The medieval peasant house was not just a primitive hut. It was a marvel of organic architecture and engineering, born out of a deep understanding of nature and stern necessity. Every decision, from the choice of location on a sunny slope to the design of the chimney, was subordinated to one great goal: to preserve life and warmth. Our ancestors built homes that were alive. They breathed through clay walls, basked in the warmth of the earth and sun, used their animals as built-in batteries. They created not just shelter, but a holistic ecosystem for survival, where every element, wood, clay, straw, in the community itself, was part of a single ingenious design. They did not fight nature, but allied with it, using its laws for their own benefit. As we study their experience, we see that the most sustainable and effective solutions do not always require sophisticated technologies and expensive materials. Sometimes they lie in wisdom, attention to the world around us, and, most importantly, in the power of human unity. The story of the peasant house is not a tale of poverty, but a hymn to human adaptation, ingenuity, and indomitable spirit. If you are interested in this journey into the world of medieval architecture, and you want to know more about how our ancestors solved seemingly insoluble problems, give us a like and subscribe to our channel. There are many more amazing stories about forgotten tricks and ingenious ideas born in the depths of centuries ahead of you.